if we keep ignoring this exponential population rise that has put us in severe ecological overshoot. Nature will reduce human population for us.
Welcome to Scientist Warning with co-hosts Regina Valdez and Patrick Lincoln, that's me. We're transmitting live from UN climate negotiations, COP25, here in Madrid, Spain. Here is our email address. We'll be displaying our email address again at the end of our presentation to make it easier for you in the audience who wish to contact us. We have an interesting panel of guests today. Alon Tal is the founder of the Israel Union for Environmental Defense and also founder of the Arava Institute for Environmental Studies. His book, The Land is Full, is a book that takes a look at the overpopulation problem in Israel. Karen Schrag, she's the director of the Wood Lake Nature Center in Richfield, Minnesota, and she's also on the advisory board for World Population Balance. Her book, Move Upstream, is a call to action to solve the overpopulation problem. Joao Abagao, he's a PhD candidate in climate change and policy for sustainable development at the University of Lisbon. His book is his master's thesis, A Human Overpopulation Atlas. It's high time we had a human overpopulation atlas. We have atlases for so many things. Today's program, a seat at the table, overpopulation and climate change.
Well, good afternoon to everybody, and I want to welcome you to a particularly unique press conference and event. I would argue also the most important one at our COP25, and that's because of the hundreds of presentations, PowerPoints, lectures, and talks. This is the only one which addresses really the core problem at the heart of almost all the planet's environmental challenges, and that would be overpopulation. Unfortunately, this is an issue which has not been a part of the discourse at all, much less a central part, which is why my colleagues and I chose to entitle today's session, A Seat at the Table. Now, I'd like to get us started by a map which shows what we've been through as a humanity. Let's recall that it was about 200,000 years ago that Homo sapiens began to wander the earth, and it took 200,000 years until we reached the number of 1 billion people. Demographers think that took place in 1802. Another century brought us a second billion people, and then we have about every 15 years, 1 billion people, up till the 7.7 billion people who fill the earth today. And as we watch the earth fill up, you can well imagine that every single dot there and the millions of people that they represent affected the environment. The United Nations tells us that population growth on the planet has slowed down somewhat, and therefore it now takes about 25 years to add another billion people. So we're looking at a population on the planet of 11 billion people by the end of the century. And we're here to tell you that this has to be a central issue when we consider global climate strategies. Now, we have been told by our faiths that we need to be fruitful, fill the earth, but the earth is full, and now it's time to think about sustainability. Let's take a look at the correlation between CO2 emissions and world population. Not surprisingly, it looks pretty close. We can take a country like South Africa. In the last 27 years since the UN FCCC was approved, we've seen a 50% increase in emissions in South Africa and a 47% increase in its population. Basically, what we have here is a representation of the fact that every day, 383,000 children are born, each one of them with an absolute right for equal opportunity, which means an equal carbon footprint. And if you look at the trends, there's starting to be a convergence of the carbon footprints around the world. So if we're talking about adding another 3 billion people, we're talking about an impossible situation. Now, another master's student, Seth Wine from the University of British Columbia, asked a simple question that was recently published in Environmental Letters. He said, what can every one of us do to reduce our carbon footprint? And there are a lot of things we could do. You can recycle. You can move to a plant-based diet is a wonderful thing to do. Buy green energy if you can move to renewables. Avoid one long trans-Pacific or Atlantic flight. That's maybe something we all need to think about here at the COP. Forget your car and move to more sustainable forms of transportation. That's one. But mostly what we hear about is recycling. But what he reached, the conclusion was the single most important thing, almost 60 times more than any other thing, have one less child.
Holy cow. May I interrupt you?
Sure.
That's a really surprising result. I wish I had known that before I decided to get 3 children. How come I didn't know?
I wish I had known it before I had 3 kids too. But the truth of the matter is, it's not really cited in the textbooks. This is one issue we don't really talk about. Now, why don't we talk about overpopulation in our environmental movements around the world? Well, for a long time now, in the climate discourse, advocates have had a great aversion to claims that overpopulation was driving the problem. For them, the problem is one of consumption, sort of the avaricious lifestyles and consumer societies of the West. That, they claim, is what's driving. And that position made a lot of sense, perhaps, back in 1992 when the convention was first adopted. At that point, the average annual carbon equivalent emissions of developing countries was about 0.5 tons, as opposed to 2.8 tons in the wealthier countries. But since that time, a lot has changed. So for a country like China, we've seen a 350% increase in its total emissions. This is good news. This means that less people are hungry. We want this kind of prosperity, but there are consequences as well. And so what we see around the world now is that although in the original days of the climate convention, developing countries dominated the emissions portfolio of the planet, today it's the other way around. Those countries that were defined as developing countries, they're the ones. India isn't quite as extreme as China, but the trends are clear there as well. And that seems to be the story everywhere. We see in countries like England, France, Scandinavian countries, a drop as much as 30 or 40% in carbon footprints. In other countries, as they adopt low carbon technologies, are going that way. And yet, in the developing world, it's coming up. So we have to start thinking about this. Now, when I think about this issue of consumption versus population, I like to go back to the metaphor that Paul Ehrlich proposed. And he said, look, this whole environmental impact, this carbon footprint is a rectangle. And today it may not be entirely sure whether the long side of the rectangle is consumption or maybe it's population. But the size of the rectangle stays the same. And my point is, unfortunately, the entire rectangle is growing because developing countries are growing rapidly in some cases, and the carbon footprint is growing as well. My own country of Israel is a case in point, and you'll have to look at this graph from right to left because we're a country that reads right to left. But basically, our overall emissions have increased over the last period of time. It's almost doubled since those days of Rio de Janeiro and the conference. And that's because our population has been growing at about 1 million people a year. So even though if you take a look at this graph, you can see a drop in per capita emissions, we can see that the overall emissions are increasing. Basically, the metaphor I like to use is we're running on a treadmill. As fast as we try to move forward, as much as we try to reduce our carbon footprint, if the world's population continues to grow the way it will, we're not going to make any progress. Size matters. And so what we hope in this session is to call on the senior players, people like the IPCC who wonderfully put in a chapter about consumption in the upcoming report, but left population off the agenda. We think we need a seat at the table. Thank you.
Thank you, Alon. That's the way I felt as a naturalist. I didn't look quite like that, but running around and teaching about the environment, and it wasn't getting any better. And I had to ask myself the deep question, why? Well, on our planet Earth, we have got to start looking at ourselves as a species, not just the only species, but that we cannot escape the laws of physics. We are like deer, we are like rabbits, we are like geese, and as they can overpopulate their habitats, so can we, and so are we. We are no different, except for one thing. Not only are we capable of overpopulating our Earth, where we are is on the top of the food chain. We are apex predators. We're presumably intelligent. But apex predators are supposed to be the least amount, and we are the most. And it is that upsetting of the food pyramid that is driving all of the issues we are talking about here at COP. We are capable, and we are decimating all other species. That's why I became a naturalist. It's because I care about other species too. But I can't teach about the environment and saving species unless I admit that my own species has made the wrong turn. We are leading to a collapse in the global food chain, resulting in human starvation on a massive scale, which has already begun in many places. So here we go. To reduce the heat, we must count the feet. Humans are collectively causing climate change. We're adding over 220,000 people per day. So our population nearing 8 billion people is a number very hard to imagine. But if you all would start snapping your fingers and wanting to do that, you will take 253 years to reach 8 billion. My goal here today is to help us to do what we all want to do, and that is to reduce misery, suffering, and premature deaths. We must not only reduce our consumption, but we must reduce our numbers. They are connected. If we keep ignoring this exponential population rise that has put us in severe ecological overshoot, nature will reduce human population for us. And there we have what we call the hockey stick curve of population. I want you to find 2 billion on this chart, if you will. And that is when my father, still among us, 93 years ago, was born at a time when the Earth was 2.2 billion. So in his lifetime, we have added 5.5 billion people to our planet and continue to act. That is astounding, one person's lifetime, and we continue to live longer on our planet. I believe that we not only have to be concerned about dying from an output of carbon and other gases, but we are dying of an excess of political correctness. It continues to impede the truth as we tend to try to be careful rather than correct. Our overpopulation activists, including myself, are falsely accused of sinister agendas, while our numbers spin out of control on our limited planet. Please take the time to look up this clock that's available, the International Population Clock. It will astound you how fast it moves. Now, a counterintuitive paradox, if you're not familiar with the Javelins Paradox, essentially is when technology progress and government policy makes resource use more efficient, well, guess what happens? The resource cost drops and demand rises. So the opposite of what you think might happen happens.
If I may,
Sure.
Karen, just to give an example here, this is usually cited, for example, in fuel efficiency. So if you drop the efficiency, if you raise the efficiency of fuel cars, people tend to fill the tank more often and drive more. So this is usually what happens when you focus on technological efficiency improvements. What happens is the Javelins Paradox occupies all discourse. We always have the same thing happening. We get more efficiency, but then people usually occupy those and tend to do the demand and just drive more in the case of cars.
We cannot always rely on altruism. We have to rely on some economic incentives, and certainly cheaper gas makes you want to drive more. Techno fixes will not save us. For example, if a lithium battery technology improves and the cost drops, we'll think of more uses. More lithium will be used. If more food can be grown per acre, which is often the solution of many biotech universities like my own University of Minnesota, then we get cheaper food. Faced with the high cost of living, if we have fewer children, notice this happy one child in the basket of food, then we have a higher cost of living, resulting in fewer children. When things become more affordable, we buy more. Oh my God, we have more children. And of course, our resources are going nowhere but down, creating all the things we've been talking about at this conference, which we're all concerned about: more landfills, incineration, ocean dumping. That's all a factor of the engine that is driving this overpopulation.
Thank you, everyone. So I wanted to address another topic here, which is perfectly connected to population rise and consumption, and that is world land use. We know that the discussion shouldn't just focus on greenhouse gases. We also know that the surface of the planet has been changing tremendously due to human activities. This in case we know that agriculture and the raising of livestock have been the single greatest factors in the extinction of non-human species, but they are also as well a significant contributor to the greenhouse gas debate around climate change due to deforestation and the conversion of natural areas, for example. So when we look at this picture right here, we see that around 27% of the world's surface is currently dedicated solely to livestock raising. This is meat and dairy production. So this is just a map that gives you an idea that North and South America both are the same area of all the livestock that is required for humans. So on the other hand, we have forests closely behind with about 26% of the world's surface, and cropland for direct human consumption with about 7%. Built-up area is around 1%. So we can make a safe prediction right here, which is that livestock and croplands, which are direct human consumption and other amenities, will both continue to rise as population growth increases as well as consumption. And the only place that this can grow is into the forests area, because these are the most fertile and productive lands on the planet. And we see this happening every day. This has an immense ecological burden on the planet, and we see it on the Amazon, for example, and other rainforests and tropical forests around the world. So this isn't just a debate around greenhouse gases, it's that our population keeps on increasing. People will want to increase their consumption of meat products, as it is described in the literature. When people get a little bit more extra money on their pockets, one of the first things they do is consume animal products. So we encourage the decrease of animal consumption, of products of animal consumption in the overdeveloped world, but this is a discussion that needs to include population as well.
Excuse me, I just want to interrupt briefly. Could you go back to that slide?
Yes.
I find it a bit disturbing that I look at the red area, and it's telling us that the same amount of land that amounts to North and South America combined amounts to the amount of land that livestock is using.
Exactly.
Yeah. I find that very disturbing.
It's our ecological burden on the planet. We increase our consumption, and one of the things that happen is that livestock and the consumption of meat products has an immense impact on the planet. So it's contracting geographical ranges from other non-human species, and it's leading to immense ecological problems. So this is where we should focus the discussion on which are the pathways that we can focus on and exhort nations and governments to try and make a difference on the projections around population. And this is where we talk about family planning. Family planning is essential, and as you can see from the picture here, there are millions of women of reproductive age in developing regions around the world who want to avoid a pregnancy but do not have the means of modern contraception to do so. And this is an immeasurable and crucial point, because when women and couples can make their reproductive decisions more consciously, this has immense benefits for the population, but as well as for women's health, and to give a better start in life for their kids, because they can share the resources more effectively between the kids that they do end up having, as well as having a better future and better opportunities. So the Guttmacher Institute also concluded that if all unmet need for contraception was achieved, women could prevent or avoid 23 million births per year that were unintended from the start, from the about 80 million that are increasing every year. So this would not be a solution for itself, but it would be a pathway. And this is one that is very ethical and is also environmentally friendly. And what I want to show you is that the population debate and the climate debate are one and the same. We are all on the same table. And that is exactly what Drawdown, the project, came up with. They studied the best solutions to fight climate change, which ones would have the best atmospheric CO2 potential in reduction. And what they came up with was that family planning and the twin solution of education of girls, which combined usually are termed women's empowerment, would lead to the greatest reduction in CO2. So this is where we need to focus our discussion. We are one and the same. This is a problem that can shift the direction of the population. We can have less people in a cycle, living in a cycle of poverty, having better start in life, and this has a lot of potential in environmental and just in the climate debate. So this is what we want nations and governments to be aware of. We are all in the same table.
Joel, if I may say something briefly.
Yeah.
I'm very happy to see the things that you have said, and I think it's really important, and I hope that some leaders out there are listening to what we're saying, because this is a big deal.
Yeah, I do as well. Please.
So I want to thank everyone in the panel for sharing their expertise, and count me in for one of the individuals who thought recycling and going vegan had a much bigger impact than it does. Indeed, family planning is an incredible thing that we need to all discuss. And Alon and Karen, you both mentioned that this is like the elephant in the room, that no one is discussing these issues of overpopulation. And I was wondering, what are some of the barriers that you see in including this in the climate agenda?
Well, let's start with the good news. The good news, we are dripping in solutions. We do not have to invent anything to solve this problem. What we do need is the courage, and the socio-political barriers need to be overcome so we do not die of political correctness. We have to overcome many religious tenets that are stuck in the Dark Ages, and as a naturalist, it's adapt or die. And this is part of the adaptation. We must change our rules and our ideas of what the future can bring based on cultural norms.
Thank you so much for that, Karen. I just have one more question, if time allows, and that is, what specific things can the global environmental community do to ensure that overpopulation is included in the climate agenda now?
Well, if I had had two specific objectives for us, operational objectives for this panel, it would be one, in the IPCC's future work, they need to start talking about population. That has to be part of the climate discourse, because if we don't do that, we'll have a lot of new technical solutions, we'll have a larger and larger population, and we'll be, as I said, running on a treadmill. The second one is the world has actually done fairly well moving towards that $100 billion climate fund. And I can't think of a better investment if indeed the number one thing we can do to reduce carbon footprints, a better investment to invest in empowerment of women, women's education, and livelihoods that will enable people to have some sort of a horizon beyond large families. If we could merge these two agendas and start bringing down, so the world was looking at 9 billion people at the end of the century as opposed to 11, I think that the climate benefits would be enormous.
If I could add, if we could ask the UN to add an SDG on population, that would be great. So we have 17 SDGs right now, so a lot of goals and objectives, but we have none which are centered around population. So we cannot continue to ignore this subject. Just put population on the radar and let's talk about it.
There, you've heard it here. Perhaps someone can take that into consideration. Meanwhile, I want to thank all of you for being here today for this discussion. So once again, you've been joined by Patrick Lincoln and myself, Regina Valdez. Here is our email, should you wish to contact us. We are coming to you live from COP25 in Madrid, Spain.